In late 2020, I figured it was about time to come out of my modern break. I had played Bogles for about 2 years prior to my break, so going back in, I wanted something new and something consistent. So with the help of my friend Ash, I looked at the MTG Goldfish meta page and I found a deck at the bottom that caught my eye. Green-White Titan. It's a deck that utilizes Flagstones of Tricair and Elvish Reclaimer alongside other Titan pieces to play a slower, more mid-rangey game plan with Titan with the same general idea of trying to go over the top. I tested it a bunch, I swapped some cards in that I did or didn't like, and I was ready to go. For the next few months at my local F&M, I had an absolute blast with the deck, and at the same time, the deck rose in popularity. At one point, it was the second most popular deck on the MTG Goldfish Modern metagame. As I was playing it, the deck felt consistent, had some fun lines it could use, and could even sideboard in Damping Sphere against Amulet Titan, a card that hurt them a lot, but did almost nothing to my game plan. And then 2021 came along, and all of a sudden, Green-White Titan fell out of the metagame. Those of you in the audience who played Modern during this time know that I'm intentionally leaving something out. The reason why it fell out of the metagame. Prior to its banning, this one card rampaged through Standard, Modern, and Pioneer. It's a card that not only encouraged stretching your mana base thin, but rewarded it. A card that pushed other control or mid-range win cons out of the meta. This is the story of Field of the Dead. Unlike with cards like Skullclamp, our knowledge on the design process of Field of the Dead is limited. What we do know is that design wanted to make a card that called back and synergized with Core 2019 reprint Scapeshift. And so, in Core 2020, Field of the Dead was revealed. Field of the Dead is a land that enters the battlefield tapped and can be tapped to add a colorless. So far, one of the worst rares ever. But, on top of this, whenever Field of the Dead or another land enters the battlefield under your control, if you control 7 or more lands with different names, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. Right off the bat, this card seems like it's designed for ramp decks in mind. It's a great payoff for getting to a high number of lands. Those decks tend to run a lot of one-of utility lands, and they're usually in 3 or more colors, so it's easier to get 7 or more lands with different names. As the design team intended, it is a good Scapeshift payoff too. Being able to tutor for it and 6 other different lands is an easy way to suddenly have a board full of zombies. See, just like with Valakut the Molten Pinnacle, Field of the Dead's trigger checks when all of the lands have already entered the battlefield off Scapeshift. So it'll trigger for each one as long as you have 7 lands with different names. But some people weren't all that impressed when it was first spoiled. Rare? Ugh. I like it in loam, exploration, fastball style stuff, but since the barrier to playing those is owning Tabernacle, I don't think I'll be using this anytime soon. It will not be the best card to build the deck around, but someone will. Just like Niv Mizzet Returned. Made for Commander, without a doubt. And while it is funny to look back on these comments in hindsight, you'll find that the majority of Magic the Gathering players are not great at card evaluation at first glance. But even in this thread, some people were cooking. A weird inverse Valakut, while Scapeshift is still legal in Standard. This may be a real deck. Core Set 20 released on July 12th, 2019. On July 13th, 2019, the first recorded instance of a Field of the Dead deck topping a Standard event happened at a Team Trios event in West Des Moines, Iowa. Funnily enough, I actually played in this Team Trios event. I was on a more traditional Bant ramp deck. Now, my team scrubbed out, but little did I know that at the top tables, history was being made. Piloted to a 6th place finish by Max Magnuson, this deck is what will become the blueprint for Field of the Dead decks going forward in Standard. Bant Scapeshift is a pure and simple ramp deck. The deck utilized Growth Spiral for card draw and ramping in a land on the opponent's turn, Circuitous Route with a Guildgate package, Grow from the Ashes as Circuitous Root number 5, Elvish Rejuvenator for Ramp plus Blocker, and Arboreal Grazer for the same reason. Rounding out the setup, Shimmer of Possibility and Narset Parter of Veils gave the deck more digging power to get to key cards, with Narset also capping your opponent's draws. Speaking of key cards, Hydroid Krasis is a powerful ramp payoff that has a draw and life gain trigger on cast, which makes that harder to interact with, and also comes in with a flying body that's scalable based on the amount of lands you have in play. Finally, let's talk about the true combo in the deck: Teferi Time Raveler and Scapeshift. Scapeshift sacrificed lands to search for that many other lands and put them onto the battlefield tapped. This was an incredibly explosive play, because not only did it give you 7 zombies at minimum, it could scale later in the game by grabbing multiple Field of the Deads. But it's a 4-mana sorcery, and Disdainful Stroke was running all over the place to try and clamp down on these powerful high mana value cards. Enter Teferi Time Raveler. Not only does Teferi's static ability turn off counter magic, its plus gave you the ability to quicken your ramp spells and Scapeshift on your opponent's end step, building a massive board out of nowhere and attacking the following turn. Despite being a pretty dedicated Field of the Dead deck, it didn't stretch its mana base too thin. The only one-ofs were a couple Guildgates and a single island. This was the bare minimum to get the job done, while not sacrificing a consistent mana base. But if you know Bant Scapeshift, you know the Breakout Event. The one that put the deck on the map. Grand Prix Denver. Louis Scott Vargas, Alan Sun, Chris Wynn, and Jackson King all piloted the deck to a top 8 finish at Grand Prix Denver, with Louis Scott Vargas winning the whole Grand Prix. This is where we see the mana base of the deck start to get stretched even thinner. Utility lands like Blast Zone and Memorial to Genius, a few life gain tap lands, and a full playset of Field of the Dead. But only 3 colors and a low pip count meant you could stretch your mana base and still play a reasonable game of Magic. After Grand Prix Denver, the cat was out of the bag, and standard players took notice. Alongside the inclusion of Golo's Tireless Pilgrim as both a way to find field and be used as a finisher, the deck went wild. Over the next few months, Bant Scapeshift was the deck to beat, representing 42% of the meta at Mythic Championship 5. Something had to be done. On October 21st, 2019, Field of the Dead was banned in Standard, and Scapeshift decks went with it. There were plenty of other ramp archetypes willing to take its place, and in the end, Fires of Invention proved to be the next top archetype. But that's a story for another day. So with Standard out of the way and Field of the Dead completely banned from it, what did it do in other formats? Pioneer became an official format in October 2019, the same month that Field of the Dead was banned in Standard. For those unfamiliar, in its early ban list, Pioneer had an interesting strategy. With the exception of the fetch lands, everything was legal. Each week, a ban list update would drop, either with no changes or sweeping bans. And honestly, this is a really interesting way to create a ban list for a new format. Instead of trying to make one beforehand based on existing information, they just let the player base go buck wild and figure out what was broken for them. And Field of the Dead showed itself to be a broken card once again. In Pioneer, Field gained access to some powerful tools. Instead of sticking with Scapeshift, the deck instead utilized Hour of Promise to immediately get Field activations going after playing 5 lands. Alongside Supreme Verdict to white boards, Once Upon a Time for consistency, Sphinx's Revelation, the OG Hydroid Krasis, and a truly insane mana base, look at this. Bask in this mana base's glory. Its life in Pioneer was short-lived. On December 2nd, 2019, Field of the Dead was banned in Pioneer alongside Once Upon a Time and Smuggler's Copter in the 3rd ban wave of the format. So far, when Field of the Dead has become a problem, there's some specific deck in the format that's designed around it. While this got a bit looser at the end of its standard lifespan, Bant Scapeshift was the primary archetype, and if not Bant Scapeshift, ramp decks in general were the main cause of Field of the Dead's power. In Pioneer, it was almost always a dedicated ramp deck trying to win with Field of the Dead. But what about a format where every deck is a ramp deck? How far would you go for inevitability? It's time to look at Modern. Immediately after its release, Field of the Dead was slotted into Amulet Titan and Red-Green Valakut decks. Being the two premier land decks of the format, this makes sense. Another win con that can help both defensively and offensively? Sign me up! Each deck was able to find room to slot Field in as a one-of, with the benefit of Field being much easier to play in Modern. By swapping your fetch land suite around and making a couple of basic snow-covered instead, you could easily support it as a one-of tech option. Fast forward a few months later, and these decks are finding room for 2 copies. In the background of Amulet Titan and Red-Green Valakut, Simic Ramp emerges. While at first glance it looks very similar to Amulet and Valakut decks, the key difference is it goes more all-in on Field, utilizing powerful Simic cards like Oko Thief of Crowns to back up this plan. With Ikoria, alongside other key printings, 4-color ramp control became a powerful user of Field of the Dead. And you heard that right, a 4-color deck was utilizing multiple copies of a colorless land. This is a deck that ran Reminisce, Omnath Locus of Creation, Growth Spiral, Uro Titan of Nature's Wrath, and was still stretching for Field of the Dead. It was all thanks to the Triomes. With the printing of the Triomes, high-colored decks could get away with running Field, because the Triomes offered great mana consistency. With Reminisce and a single fetch land, the deck could get perfect mana. And let's not forget the elephant in the room, Uro Titan of Nature's Wrath. This card was so powerful at this time in Modern that every deck in Modern would splash blue or splash green, and suddenly everyone was a ramp deck. Temur Reclamation, Field of the Dead. Sultai Control, Field of the Dead. Blue-White Control, the classic Modern deck, stretched its 2-color mana base thin enough to support Field of the Dead. Once again, something had to be done. On February 15th, 2021, Field of the Dead was banned in Modern, and with that, the banlist trifecta was complete. It's always funny to look back at cards that started as a bulk rare to some and quickly became out of control and banned in multiple formats. Field of the Dead is probably my favorite example of this. Not because of some tragic irony or metagame warping that I found amusing, it's legitimately my favorite example of this to play. I love playing lands decks in Eternal formats, and Field of the Dead is one of my favorite payoffs. This single card was powerful enough to cause people to bend and stretch and just break their mana bases as hard and as far as they could. And it's probably for the best that it stays banned. Can you imagine Nadu in Modern with Field of the Dead? The grind game on the card is truly insane. But Field of the Dead's reign of terror wasn't all for nothing. Going forward, Wizards always made sure that consistent non-basic land hate was in Standard as a safety valve in case something like Field happened again. As for Modern, while Simic Ramp disappeared from a combination of losing Field and losing Uro, Amulet Titan persisted without it. But unfortunately, without Field of the Dead to hold up a more mid-rangey plan, Green-White Titan, my deck of choice, immediately fell out of the meta. Ah well, can't win them all. And while Field of the Dead resulted in some of the funniest looking deck lists Modern has ever seen, there is one in the final days of Field's legality that trumps them all. A final hurrah in an MTGO Championship qualifier. Instead of a whisper, Field of the Dead went out with a bang, or should I say, a cascade.